When I decided to renovate the house I inherited from my grandfather, I expected surprises, but nothing like what I found in the basement. Built in the 1940s, the house was sturdy, yet aged, with cracked walls and a damp basement filled with old belongings. My plan was to turn the basement into a functional space, maybe a study or a small office. The day I discovered the hidden hatch marked the start of events that will haunt me forever. While clearing out debris and forgotten boxes, I noticed a wooden panel out of place on the cement floor. It was rotted at the edges, as if someone had tried to conceal it long ago. Beneath it was a metal hatch, secured with a rusty lock. The lock seemed untouched, and something about it hinted it had been there for decades. Curiosity overtook caution. I grabbed a saw, cut through the lock, and lifted the hatch. A musty, stale odor wafted up, as though the space had been sealed for ages. Flashlight in hand, I descended to find a small underground shelter, barely 2 by 3 meters, with basic furnishings, a makeshift bed, stacks of dusty canned goods, and an old battery-powered radio. It looked as though whoever had used the shelter intended to return, but never did. I felt a chill as I noticed the cans were surprisingly well preserved, seemingly untouched by time. In a corner, a dust-covered notebook lay unopened. When I flipped through it, the pages were blank. That night I couldn't sleep. The shelter fascinated and unsettled me. Who built it? Why was it sealed? My mind swirled with questions, but answers seemed elusive. At 3 a.m., I woke to rhythmic thumping from the basement. It was steady and deliberate, as though someone was pounding on the hatch from below. I froze. I had sealed the hatch with a new lock. There was no way anyone could be down there, or so I thought. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs. The noise stopped the moment I turned on the basement light. The hatch was undisturbed, the lock intact. Shaking, I convinced myself it was my imagination and returned to bed, though sleep evaded me. The next morning, I hired a structural expert to inspect the shelter. As we descended, his demeanor shifted from curiosity to unease. He pointed out faint scratch marks on the walls, subtle but forming patterns resembling symbols. When I asked his thoughts, he simply said, "This wasn't part of the original design. Someone else was here." That night, the thumping returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it seemed to echo through the house. I hesitated before descending, but what I found chilled me to my core. Muddy footprints leading from the hatch to the basement stairs. They were small, almost childlike. Panicked, I decided to seal the shelter permanently. I poured cement over the hatch, creating a thick barrier. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief, believing this would end the disturbances. But the following nights proved otherwise. The pounding persisted, now coming from the walls as if something or someone was desperate to escape. Desperate for answers, I delved into the house's history. I discovered that in the 1960s, a reclusive man lived there and was suspected in the disappearance of several neighborhood children. While no evidence ever linked him to the crimes, the rumors were enough to drive him to sell the house. Chillingly, many of the children vanished at precisely 3 a.m., the same hour as the thumping. I couldn't stay another night. I moved out, but even now, in my new home, I sometimes hear that same rhythmic pounding in the dead of night. I've learned to ignore it, but deep down, I know I'll never truly be alone. I never thought I'd have a story like this to tell, but here I am, still trying to make sense of it all. After my divorce, I decided to start fresh in a small, quiet town. I found an old house that felt just right. Charming, affordable, and full of potential. There was only one odd thing about it. The basement was sealed shut. When I asked the real estate agent about it, he shrugged and said the previous owners had sealed it because it was prone to flooding. It seemed plausible enough, and honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The house was cozy, and I was starting to settle in. But then one night, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was coming from the basement door. At first, I told myself it must be the house settling, or maybe an old pipe knocking. But the noise continued, sporadically at first, then more regularly. Some nights it was a light tapping. Other times, it sounded like scratching, faint and deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to hire a locksmith to open the door. When he arrived, he inspected the lock and frowned. This wasn't sealed because of flooding, he said. This was reinforced to make sure no one could get in or out. That sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. Well, let's see what's behind it, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. When the door finally creaked open, a wave of stale, cold air hit us. The smell was earthy, damp, and faintly metallic. I turned on my flashlight and began to descend the narrow staircase. The basement was larger than I expected, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. In one corner there was an old stained mattress. Next to it, rusted chains were bolted to the wall, ending in small child-sized shackles. My stomach turned, but what really unnerved me were the carvings on the walls. Scrawled in shaky, uneven letters were words like, "Help, let me out," and the same phrase over and over, "He sees me, even here." I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, and I could swear I felt eyes on me. Without thinking, I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I asked the locksmith to reseal it immediately, and he didn't argue. That night I couldn't sleep. The tapping sound came back, louder than ever, and this time it was accompanied by something else. Faint, shuffling footsteps, as if someone or something was pacing up and down the basement stairs. I called the police the next day. When they investigated, they didn't find anyone. But they did find something else, a hidden tunnel at the far end of the basement, leading deep underground. I didn't stick around to learn more. I packed a bag and left that night. I sold the house at a loss and never looked back. The last I heard, the new owners moved out within months after something indescribable happened. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that basement. But sometimes when the house comes to mind, I wonder if whatever was down there is still waiting. When we moved into our new home, it felt like a dream come true. The house had an old-world charm, with its ivy-covered stone facade and wooden floors that creaked softly, as if whispering secrets of its past. There was a certain magic in the air, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The most intriguing part, however, was the basement. The real estate agent had described it as full of potential, but something about its dimly lit entrance made my stomach tighten ever so slightly. Our daughter, Lily, was the first to explore it. She was 6 years old and endlessly curious, always finding adventure where others might not. While we were busy unpacking upstairs, her small voice echoed up to us. "Mommy, Daddy, come down here," she called, her tone a mix of excitement and wonder. Curious, We descended the creaky stairs to find her standing in front of the far wall. She pointed, wide-eyed, at something etched into the stone. I stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a crude, childlike drawing, a cluster of small figures with hollow circles for eyes, tears streaming down their faces. Beside them was a large black rectangle, its edges jagged and uneven, as if pulsating with darkness even in its stillness. We exchanged uneasy glances, but my husband, ever the rational one, shrugged it off. "Probably just an old doodle from one of the previous owners," he said. We decided to paint over it to make the space feel brighter and less eerie. He spent an afternoon meticulously applying a fresh coat of white paint while whistling a tune to himself. Yet by the next morning, the paint over the etched section hadn't dried. It was damp and sticky, stubbornly resisting our attempts to cover it. That was just the beginning. Lily started complaining about strange noises at night. She would clutch her stuffed rabbit tightly and whisper, "I hear laughing. It sounds like kids playing hide and seek, but they don't sound happy." We chalked it up to her imagination until I heard something myself. One evening, as I folded laundry in the quiet stillness of the house, I heard it. Soft, hesitant footsteps, bare feet on the cold basement floor. My heart raced as I froze, straining to listen. When I mentioned it to my husband, he dismissed it as the house settling or the old pipes creaking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was down there. It wasn't until a few nights later that things escalated. I was tucking Lily into bed when I noticed her staring intently at the ceiling, her small face pale. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The children don't like it when we lock the basement door. They told me so." A chill ran down my spine. Forcing a calm smile, I asked, "What children, sweetie?" Her little finger pointed downward, toward the floor. "The ones from the wall." That was the moment we knew something was seriously wrong. My husband began digging into the house's history, uncovering a chilling story. In the 1940s, the building had been used as a makeshift schoolhouse during the war. Several children mysteriously disappeared, and the school closed abruptly. No one was ever able to explain what had happened. We tried to dismiss the connection until we found an old photograph tucked away in a hidden compartment in the attic. It showed a group of children standing in front of the house. Their faces were eerily similar to the figures etched on the basement wall. Desperate for answers, we reached out to a local historian who specialized in the paranormal. The moment he stepped into the basement, his expression darkened. "This isn't just a drawing," he said, his voice low and trembling. "It's a warning." He explained that the black rectangle wasn't merely symbolic, it represented a door. These doors were sometimes used in rituals to bind entities or energies. Whoever carved this was trying to contain something, not commemorate it. The realization hit us like a thunderclap. We didn't wait to find out what might happen next. That night we packed a few belongings and left the house our dream home turned into a nightmare we would never forget.